OK, where have we got? Cortona paints astronomical ceilings in the Pitti Palace for the Duke, who's turned on by Torricelli's discovery of the vacuum at the top of a tube of mercury. Barometers and weather forecasts excite Perrault, whose brother starts the literary revolt that also involves Swift, whose pal Bishop Berkeley thinks up a new theory of vision, confirmed by Young, who then gets deeply into ancient Egyptian. Young cracks the ancient Egyptian language because, quite by accident, he gets involved with an ancient Egyptian stone covered in writing. One day, when he had nothing better to do, somebody lent him the Rosetta Stone to play with. Here it is in the British Museum. Snitched by the Brits in Egypt, spoils of war. The same text in 3 different scripts. Greek and 2 different ways of writing ancient Egyptian. Young takes a closer look at this kind. After a while, Young decides that the little groups of signs that repeat all over the place must be common words, like and that bigger groups that appear regularly could be some kind of title, like king, maybe. Then he finds names he knows, in the Greek writing, like Ptolemy, and locates where they are in the Egyptian. And sure enough, it all starts to make sense. Once you've done that with this kind of Egyptian writing, you just repeat the trick for hieroglyphs. All this you can do thanks to this giant book, produced by Napoleon scientists after they invade Egypt in 1799, where, as I mentioned, the Brits clobber Napoleon and then grab the Rosetta Stone. Thing is, the book's got a zillion drawings of what they all saw up the Nile, including a load more inscriptions for the hieroglyph codebreakers to work on. And there are all these drawings because of the speed those Frenchmen were working at up the Nile, getting the lead out, in more senses than one. Because France has just solved the great French pencil crisis. See, because of the war with England and everybody else, French imports have been blocked. So pencils, which they have always imported, are in short supply. By 1795, things are so desperate, they're licking their stubs. And then French genius solves the problem. A fellow called Nicolas Conte invents a mixture of graphite and clay, and voila, an amazing new artificial pencil lead. That's why that giant pencil sketchbook got done up the Nile. And then published by that pencil inventor Nicolas Conte. Successful guy. A bit of a high flyer, really. Conte's previous job has been chief of military balloons for Napoleon, so he's going up in the world. With the aid of telescopes, battles are orchestrated by French generals. They win, often, because up here, it's easier to see what they're up to down there. However, for some strange reason, Napoleon takes against the idea, and that's the end of French hot air. Well, kind of. Meanwhile, ballooning takes off elsewhere. By 1861, there's an American Civil War going on, and ballooning freak Professor Thaddeus Lowe gets up to all kinds of tricks, like hovering above the Battle of Chickahominy on June the 1st, 1862, and sending telegraph messages down a wire to the Union general below about what the Confederate Army is doing. The general in question is George McClellan, who's running the Army of the Potomac and is one of the few people to realize you can spy with a balloon. Bright guy. Mind you, the general's had some experience at skullduggery before the war, when he's president of the Illinois Central and hires a detective to run railroad security. This detective is then conscripted by McClellan during the war to become a master spy. Bad news after the war for Butch Cassidy. He's among the more famous criminals, like Jesse James, caught by McClellan's now very experienced spy. Once he gets out of the army and opens the greatest detective agency in the history of the United States, and named after him, the Pinkerton. Alan Pinkerton's casebook looks like the who's who of crookery. He's the first to recognize that criminals have an M.O. He's a master of disguises and has a great collection of wigs, false moustaches, etc. But it's this that turns out to be Pinkerton's most famous case. Here, in the Pennsylvania coalfields in the 1870s. The case involves a bunch of Irish anarchists who are causing all kinds of mayhem, arson, murder, blowing up trains, and other such political statements. This bunch of fun-loving fellows becomes known as the Molly Maguires. Pinkerton decides to infiltrate the gang. Fortunately for him, he has just the right guy for the job. His name is James McParlin, Irish, Catholic, and tough, who gets a job as a miner and starts to act Irish, Catholic, and tough. For 2 years, he sends Pinkerton secret reports and avoids killing the people he's been ordered to by taking to whiskey so the Mollies will think he's a hopeless drunk, and becomes a hopeless drunk. Finally, just as the Mollies are getting wise to him, he gets out by the skin of his teeth with enough evidence to bring the Mollies to justice. They hang 13 of them. McParlin goes off to Denver to recover from the booze and dies a broken man. Still, he does become famous in England. This is where McParlin would have become famous if this place had ever really existed, or the fellow who is supposed to have lived here, neither of which ever happened. But you try telling that to the fans, who've been making the pilgrimage to this place for the last 100 years, and who, 100 years ago, learn all about McParlin in a novel called The Valley of Fear, based on McParlin's adventures with the Molly Maguires. But not starring McParlin. Oh, no. Starring the guy who never existed, who didn't live here at 221B Baker Street, or wear a deerstalker, or play the violin, or smoke a pipe, or have a physician sidekick, or take dope. Because here is where my story ends. So let me review the clues and see if you can guess who never lived here. Beetle Freak Wallace, Lodge and Telegraphy, Fessenden's Radio, used by banana growers, top banana in banana science, Condol, who gets the Swiss into stamps used on postcards, with cartoons of the Gothic Houses of Parliament, inspired by Herder's Romantic movement, inspired by fake Scottish poems. The exiled Scots escaped to North Carolina, making turpentine, used for making Chinese lacquer on tin plate Colbert once. French Navy decorator Puget, who paints places where they play with barometers. The weather freak, whose brother's writing turns on Swift, whose pal Barclay has visual theories that Young confirms while decoding ancient Egyptian from examples sketched by pencils invented by French balloonists. The American balloon spy Pinkerton and his intrepid agent McParlin, who becomes famous in England. Phew. Got it? Detective McParlin is made famous in England by the greatest detective of them all. Because The Valley of Fear is the last Sherlock Holmes story Conan Doyle ever writes. And that's the end of my whodunit. But if you got the clues as we went along, you got there ahead of me. As Sherlock himself might have said, "It was elementary, my dear Watson.